Good day. I am Ann Mosikowski, President of the League of Women Voters of Central Delaware County. And on behalf of our league, I want to thank you for joining us for our hot topic, immigration issues in southeastern Pennsylvania, the big picture. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization which neither supports or opposes candidates, but does encourage informed and active participation in citizenship, elections, and democracy, and works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. One of the ways we help fulfill our mission to empower voters and defend democracy is to offer presentations to inform the public and voters on the importance of exercising your right to vote within our democracy. Today's program is a good example of informing our communities about vital issues that impact our mission. The hot topic was coordinated through our civic education and diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. This presentation is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be posted to our YouTube channel and shared with all those that registered. And now I'd like to turn it over to Marilyn Gilroy, co-chair of our Voter Information Committee, and she will introduce our presenters and moderate the discussion. Marilyn.
Okay, well, today we're really very fortunate to have two people, Zeke Hernandez and Stephen Larin. Is that how you say your last name, Stephen? Larin?
That works. That's good.
Okay. We're going to start with Zeke. He's a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and he focuses on two broad areas. He will explain how immigration patterns affect several key choices, decisions, and performance in foreign markets, as well as a linkage between immigration and economic growth. Zeke has written a book, The Truth About Immigration: Why Successful Societies Welcome Newcomers. Zeke can expand on its content and how to purchase it. In addition, Zeke Hernandez is the Max and Bernice Garchik Family Presidential Associate Professor at the Wharton School. His research linking immigration to investment and economic growth has won multiple prizes, including an unprecedented 3 emerging scholar awards from the top academic associations in his field. He's also one of the highest rated teachers at Wharton, a Poets and Quants Best Business Professor in the world, and one of the youngest recipients of a presidential professorship at the University of Pennsylvania. He loves his family, soccer, and meeting people from all over the world. So meet Zeke. That is Zeke. And now we're going to talk about Stephen. We are very fortunate to have Stephen with us today. Stephen is an attorney, and he's the Deputy Director of the Nationalities Service Center. He specializes in removal defense, asylum, and immigrant youth issues. He can further expand on his responsibility in the center's diversity, equity, and inclusion program. Steve has served as an adjunct professor for the Immigration Law Clinic at Temple University, Beasley School of Law, and for the Political Science Department at LaSalle University. After this discussion, what I'm hoping that we'll all get from this is that we're going to learn a lot about immigrants and what we as League members can do to support immigrants and provide them with opportunities to ease their adjustment to a new country. The Nationalities Service Center is a 4-star charity on the Charity Navigator website, and United Way website can also help with workplace giving. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Zeke now.
Okay, great. Can everyone see and hear me? Wonderful. I'm going to just share a few slides with you to begin. And let me first just thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. And thank you for all the good work that you do as an organization. And I'm also really grateful for the work that people like Stephen and his organization do. I'm going to speak very broadly today, and I want to tell you about this new book I've written, whose cover and title you can see there. I'll provide more information on how you can find the book if you're interested later. Let me just jump right in, and let me jump right in by telling you a little bit about who I am. So I appreciate what Marilyn said. I just want to mention that my journey to study in immigration in some ways was very accidental. I did not intend to become an immigration scholar. I always wanted to understand economic growth, what creates economic growth, what helps people come out of poverty, and what helps communities and nations prosper. And when I was in graduate school, as I was trying to study these issues, I realized that the movement of people, both within and across countries, is inseparable from what creates economic growth and prosperity. And so for nearly 20 years now, I've been doing research connecting those two things. And so this book is an encapsulation of what I've learned over those nearly 20 years. Now, let me tell you why I wrote the book and why the message is so important. After having been doing research on how migration affects our economy for over a decade, I started receiving invitations to speak to groups like yours, about the connection between those two things. One of the very first ones was the Rotary Club of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, just about an hour from where I live here. And I remember thinking, how can I engage this group to make it interesting? And so I developed a 10-question quiz. And I thought, well, I'm going to kind of break the ice with the audience by asking them 10 really basic questions about immigrants and what immigrants do to our economies. And I thought, that will be a good way to just get started. And I administered these 10 questions, and I realized that essentially nobody knew the answers to them. And these were very basic things, like what percentage of the country are immigrants, or really things that I thought people knew. And I thought, okay, maybe there's something unique about that group. And then I started getting invited by other groups, for example, Columbia Business School alumni, which are highly educated and fairly wealthy people. And I thought, well, maybe this group might be a little bit better informed. And they got all the questions wrong as well. I got invited to speak to church groups in different communities, and same thing. To my students, same thing. To reporters, a lot of journalists were not well informed on the issues. Business executives of leading companies in the world, same thing. They just did not know the facts. And perhaps most depressingly of all, congressional staffers on Capitol Hill, whose responsibility is to be in charge of immigration policy. And so what that experience taught me over a few years was that there's a widespread misunderstanding about just very basic facts about who immigrants are and what they do. And I thought, wow, that's strange. And could there be a source? Could there be something out there to help us provide those facts? And I kept waiting for someone to write sort of the go-to book, the go-to source that could answer all the questions that we have about immigrants and jobs, immigrants and our economy, immigrants and the border, et cetera. And I even had a list of people who I thought would write that book who were more famous than I am, and nobody was doing it. And so at some point I decided to say, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring and just write this book myself. And so that's what this book is. It comes from my experience in speaking to audiences and trying to connect the evidence with what people know. But one of the things that I also discovered was that one of the reasons you don't have an easily accessible, apolitical, fact-based volume on immigration is because immigration is a little bit like, I'm sure you know that story of the blind men touching different parts of the elephants. All of us, I think, know that, right? But in case you don't, it's a story of how one of the blind men is touching the tail and says, oh, it's a rope, and another one is touching the tusk and says it's a snake, and et cetera. And immigration is a little bit like that. It's such a big issue that people have really different perceptions of it depending on what angle they're looking at it, but nobody's seeing the full animal, so to speak. And so this book is intended to help you see the full animal and why it's so important. Now, why is it so important for you to see the full animal, so to speak? It's because in this country, there are two dominant narratives about immigration, and both of them are wrong, okay? One of the dominant narratives, which is illustrated by the picture you see on the left, is what I call the villain narrative. The story that immigrants hurt us because they steal our jobs, they undermine our security, they change our precious culture, etc. Okay, and there's certainly a political movement that's very motivated by that story. That story is not right based on the facts, but here's what's interesting: the other story is not a good counter argument to it. So the other narrative is illustrated by the Statue of Liberty and by Emma Lazarus's famous poem, right? That immigrants are the poor, huddled masses, the wretched refuse who deserve our compassion and our help. And it's a really evocative, very nostalgic type of argument. And it's often presented as a counter to the villain narrative, but it's not. It turns out that these two arguments are perfectly compatible with each other. And controversially, I'll say that Emma Lazarus's poem has done a lot of disservice to how we think about immigration, because it then comes down to a narrative of, well, immigrants are hurting us, or we need to be compassionate to them, even if it costs us. And those aren't counters to each other. The other thing that's interesting about both narratives is that they're both based on fear. The villain narrative is about fear that immigrants will hurt us. The victim narrative is fear that we're not doing enough to help the needy. But the truth is that neither of those narratives are correct. When you look at the data, when you take a rigorous look at the evidence, another narrative, a third narrative comes up. And this is, I think, the narrative that we need to be pushing, not just in this election year, but generally. And that's the narrative that I call factual optimism, that when you look at the facts, there's a lot of reason to be positive about immigration. Now, I don't have time in these introductory remarks to go through the whole story, and you would probably fall asleep if I did. So let me just give you a very, very quick overview of what I mean when I say this. So the short of it is that when you look at the evidence, factual optimism suggests that immigrants are net positive contributors to everything that's on your wish list for an economically prosperous and a socially vibrant community. And just think here in southeastern Pennsylvania, you don't even have to think nationally. What do you want? What's your wish list for your community? My guess is that you'll have things like this: investment, cultural vitality, job creation, low crime, innovation, security, consumption, artistic creation, tax revenue, demographic balance, talent, and just a community that renews itself and doesn't stay stagnant. Well, the short of it is, folks, that when you look at the evidence, immigrants contribute positively to all of those things on your wish list, okay? And again, I don't have time to go through it all, but for example, you probably might not have heard that where immigrants arrive, companies invest more, and those investments create new jobs. You might have seen businesses created by immigrants, but you might not know that immigrants are 80% more likely than natives to start a business. You might not know that immigrants are only 16% of inventors in the US, but they account for 36% of all patents. You might not know that immigrants actually commit crimes at a much lower rate than natives, especially undocumented immigrants. It turns out that the least likely to commit a crime are undocumented immigrants in this country. You might not know that our national security would be threatened were it not for a lot of the new ideas and technological advances that immigrants create. You might not know that artistic creations like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or God Bless America were written by immigrants. There are entire industries that would disappear were it not for the job positions that immigrants fill because natives don't want to take those positions. So whatever you want in a good community, a reasonable number of immigrants, and it doesn't have to be an overwhelming number, renews us and creates really a prosperous society. All right, I have two more things to say and then I'll finish. So the book covers all of that. The first part answers all the economic questions you've had about immigrants. The second part covers all the hot button social issues, from assimilation to crime to safety to undocumented immigration to what's wrong with our immigration system. But I'm confident that once you know the evidence, you'll be able to have a more informed opinion as a voter, but also you'll be more informed in terms of what you advocate for as an organization. I want to say one thing, that the book is not written as just a list of facts and figures and charts. It's a book that's written in narrative form. It has a lot of stories. It includes a lot of my own story as an immigrant to the United States. And that's a way to make the narrative palatable instead of just being a bunch of numbers. All right, let me say one more thing and I'll be done. We're in a very important moment in the history of immigration in the United States. This chart shows the percentage of immigrants in the US population since we've had records in 1850. And what you can see is it's a bit of a roller coaster, right? The number of immigrants sort of shot up in the late 1800s, reached about 15% of the population, and then like a roller coaster sort of went way down between the 1920s and 1970, and then kind of shot back up again starting in about 1970, 1980, okay? Why did this roller coaster shoot down so fast in the 1920s? It's because we're almost exactly 100 years to the day from when the US passed the most restrictive law in immigration history, the 1924 National Quotas Act. And that law was passed in response to fear about Southern and Eastern Europeans who were entering our country en masse in the early 1900s, people from countries like Italy, Ukraine, Russia, Greece. These were Catholics and Jews and people who really scared a lot of the establishment 100 years ago, in the same way that today Asians, Latin Americans, and Muslims are scaring us. And the question is, will we make the same decision that was made back then to shut them out, or will the roller coaster keep climbing or stay steady? Now, we know from the evidence that the 1924 law had really negative effects on the American economy and on our society. And so not just this year, but this election and this moment is really critical. And I think knowing the truth about immigration is more important than ever. I'm going to stop there. If you're interested in learning more or ordering a copy of the book, there are a few ways that you can do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zeke. It's very interesting information that so many of us didn't know so much. So let's turn to Steve now.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to present. I appreciate it. It's the second time I'm presenting to the League over many years. It's an issue that the League takes seriously and is a critical issue on lots of elections. So I'm happy to be with you again. And a special shout out to Mrs. Marita Green, of course, for keeping that connection alive with the League. I'm going to address a few of the, sort of big picture as well, sort of keeping in that theme, because there are, as you all know, a million different things involved with immigration law and immigration policies that we could spend, days on each one, really. But let me actually go to present mode here so it looks better for everybody. So, I think it's this hot topic issue, obviously election year. But also because of the numbers at the border. And I saw some of the questions submitted beforehand and also right now during the chat, talking about the border. And so often that issue is framed as a border crisis and what we're going to do about that. And I think part of looking at the big picture is reframing that as a humanitarian crisis, right? It's thinking about, the causes and the reasons the numbers of people that are arriving at our southern border exist. You'll know, right, that in the headlines and in the debates in Congress, there are a lot of questions about how to address it, from building up walls to shutting down borders after certain numbers are reached for the day, things of that nature, how to make asylum more difficult for folks because a lot of people are seeking asylum. A lot of those issues are coming up, but I think in order to think about those, we need to sort of know why folks are here. And the last thing, just to sort of frame the border, we know that at the end of last calendar year, right, in December, there was a record number of people being encountered at the border, over 200,000 people encountered at the border that month. And then since that time, just, those numbers have come down, despite there being moments, right, as the weather is improving, that you would think those numbers would rise again. But they have been coming down. There are different policies and foreign policy negotiations that have taken place that are sort of contributing to that. Part of it, I think, sort of reminds us that a lot of our immigration law and policies are tied very closely to our foreign policy and our relationship with other countries, including on how to have a more orderly process for people to arrive in the country. So big picture, right? We have to think about, so many of the people arriving at the border are seeking asylum, are seeking refuge, humanitarian assistance. Worldwide, there's nearly 110 million people who have been forcibly displaced, right? And you can see, right, sort of the numbers in the chart here, sort of where that spiked since 2012, let's say. It's more than doubled the number of people forcibly displaced across the world, right? And so we see large numbers from Syria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Venezuela, Haiti, and we can go on and on. And this is the context where we look at those change in numbers of people arriving at the border and why they're arriving. We have to keep that in mind. There's all those issues that take place around the world present themselves, right, and at our borders and our immigration policies. As a part of that, we also see the arrival of unaccompanied children. This is to the U.S. specifically, and it's not all the encounters with unaccompanied children. This is the ones actually who weren't from Mexico and Canada that didn't. Well, I'll just say, so all unaccompanied children are able to be referred to seek some services in the U.S. and sort of begin a process, get put in proceedings and so on. Children from Mexico and Canada that arrive at the border have an extra hurdle. They have to show that they have a fear of persecution or human trafficking. And if they show that, then they're able to be put in this process where they have an opportunity for a hearing to see if they're allowed to stay in the country. And I put this here because as we think about who is arriving at the border, the numbers clearly indicate that more and more families, as opposed to single men, more and more families and children continue to arrive at the border. There was a study done back in 2014 where you see there was a spike as well in unaccompanied children, talking about the phenomena, but talking about that children do not migrate, they flee, right? If we're talking about children taking on a dangerous journey, being sent by their parents or coming on their own to reunite sometimes with family members, it's not a question of like, oh, this is the economic choice I'm making for myself. It's a question of the situation I'm leaving and running from was so dangerous that I'm willing to take on the danger of this journey, right? The crime that happens on all sorts of levels, for people who are migrating and taking that long journey is a huge number, a huge percentage of the unaccompanied children are victims of serious crimes along the route. But what they're fleeing from in many countries, the extreme violence, organized crime, gang violence, crimes against women, domestic violence, all sorts of these crimes are serious enough. So we see those numbers continue to rise as well. Just a little context, since we're talking about Southeast Pennsylvania, and this showing the population in the surrounding counties. You'll see the chart. You see it says Philadelphia suburban counties. Just to be clear, it's not just Bucks, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery. You'll see at the bottom there also includes counties in New Jersey and Maryland. So the number's high there. But just to get a sense that from 1970 on to about 2016 or so, maybe a little earlier, the growth of the population was faster in the suburbs of Philadelphia than in Philadelphia. So that was true for a while, issues of the economy and job availabilities and so on. But then in the last several years, the rate of increase in both the counties and the suburbs in Philadelphia have been about the same. So just to give a little context, a little more locally there. But then returning to the idea of people who are immigrating, back to the fact that there are many different issues that lead to the immigration. And I was referring to that there's foreign policy decisions that have impacted even the reduction in numbers of people arriving at the border now. Some of those have been negotiations with Mexico, for Mexico to put more money and funding towards preventing immigration through their country. That's had significant impact on the numbers arriving. But part of the reason numbers increased dramatically in the last few years too, we're beginning to see more and more immigrants at the border from South America as well. And definitely from Africa and Asia coming through Latin America. In December of last year, just a little further context, in December of last year was the first time where arrivals from countries other than Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala outnumbered the arrivals from those four countries, because historically, in the recent history, those four countries have been the bulk of arrivals at the southern border. But starting December, people from Venezuela, Ecuador, Haiti, different countries outnumbered that group there. So this slide that you're seeing right now is about the Darien Gap, right? So sort of a jungle area, tropical area between Colombia and Panama. So that's a route that many people are increasingly taking. That for a long time, people didn't traverse it because it's very dangerous. A lot of people, lost their lives in trying to traverse that. But as many developments, organized crime has played a bigger role in sort of regulating or taking advantage of migrants and charging money for folks. They have worked to clear this path and control the path as a way to make some money. We could tie it into all sorts of developments in Colombia as well, but suffice it to say for this conversation that because that passage has been made more accessible, you see the rise in numbers, right? I mean, we're talking significant rise to nearly 500,000 last year going, through that route that before was basically shut off. So increasing the number of people. That to go along with the fact that, the issues that economy of Venezuela, the violence in Ecuador, issues in Colombia are also taking place. And you look at the recent years, the pandemic is another part to keep in mind, and the impact the pandemic had on countries now where people are fleeing because the economies struggled, collapsed, different governments to control, different authoritarian things. All that to say that these things are leading many to migrate and to look for help. And as they're fleeing dangerous situations, it becomes that they're asking for asylum or other humanitarian relief at the border. And I'll just say in context that often people talk about, well, are they cutting the line when they're asking for asylum and so on, when they're arriving at the southern border? And I'll just remind folks, because I'm sure many of you know, that there's no single line for any immigrant to enter the US, of course. But even if we look at family-based applications, the amount of time that people are waiting to enter the US based on those applications was tremendous. If we just look at Mexico, people trying to immigrate from Mexico based on family-based applications, talk about the children, unmarried sons and daughters of US citizens. If they're from Mexico, it's about a 23-year wait for their application to be processed. If it's a married son or daughter of a citizen, it's a little longer. It's about 26 years. Even if we do the shortest based on some of these categories, that the spouse and minor children of residents, it's over a 4-year wait, which compared to 25 sounds short, but we're talking about 4 years of waiting to be reunited with your spouse or minor children to be reunited with their parents outside of the country, often in difficult situations. And, the ask that people wait in line when it's an inefficient process, where there aren't sufficient visas for people to enter quickly and be reunited with lawful permanent resident relatives, US citizen relatives, leads people to flee dangerous situations and seek another way to enter. And I'll just, I know there's not a lot of time on the intro, but I'll just add that, the folks that are arriving at the border and presenting themselves to immigration are asking for humanitarian relief. That is a lawful process. Under the laws of the US, people have the right to seek asylum in the US, right? This is not unlawful, immigrants in the country. They are lawfully presenting themselves and saying, this is the relief we're asking for. And then they're in the US to seek that process. Now, the process takes a long time. And those are other issues we could talk about, but there is in immigration courts a backlog of 3.5 million cases at this point. That's the number of cases in immigration court. Getting close to 800 immigration judges. I mean, it's going to take years and years to get through those cases. And for many people, that's the way they would get status. So they're going through the correct process. And I'll make one more point and then sort of open it up to questions. Hopefully we can talk more about it. But there are examples of communities who have similar concerns of persecution and danger in their home countries that have been treated very differently, even though some also arrived at the border. But we're talking about the Afghan community people coming in from Ukraine, the US has shown that when the interest is there and the support is there, that folks fleeing those dangerous situations can be brought to the US or allowed to enter the US, given work permits right away. People arriving from Ukraine have expedited process to have work authorization and are getting other benefits that are reserved for refugees as well, and are doing well. There's been over nearly 200,000 arrivals under the Uniting for Ukraine program, and hundreds of thousands more people from Ukraine have arrived in the US. And we don't hear the same concern about, oh, too many immigrants from Ukraine arriving in the US, because there have been decisions made as to this is a community that we want to enter. Afghan, an amazing local response to welcoming Afghan evacuees. There's been over 100,000 Afghans who have come to the US. Pennsylvania, it's probably in the low thousands now of people that have come from the country. In the first year, there was about 1,500. About a third of them resettled in the Philadelphia area. And it was the response from the community that was not only sort of immigrant serving organizations, but it was religious organizations, employers, landlords, veterans groups, parties, across the aisle, and multiple, like, interested in, like, what can we do to help this community, in offering different sort of access to quicker work permits, things of that nature, jobs, housing, things of that nature. And I'll just, the last thing I'll say before opening it up is that, I'm sure Professor Hernandez, covers this in his book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. It's fantastic, always looking for that data to support it. But having read some other studies as well, the idea that what I've read is that refugees, overall sort of progress quicker economically in the US than other immigrants. And one of those main differences, because you're thinking about refugees, are people who have suffered extreme traumas and violence and danger and so on, but they have access to certain initial benefits, nothing significant. It's a short period of time, but there's some cash assistance, there's some connection to service organizations and communities that then sort of make that acculturation, assimilation to the country easier. It's happening with those from Ukraine. We hope it's happening with those from Afghanistan. And it is a process that we've shown can work. And it's a decision that's made about which communities and get that welcome and which don't. And there are other reasons why that happens. But I'll leave it there. I know I talked a lot and there's a lot more to cover.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. Does anyone like to pose a question at this point?
Yes, those people that are coming in with drugs, like the drug cartel people, how are they managing that? How are we managing that? That's what I think people are afraid of too, of, the crime. I don't know what the percentage is, but I would just be interested in that.
Yeah, well, I can give you the big picture on that. I think Stephen will have a better handle on the legal issues, but I think it's important to recognize that there is drug trade that happens through the southern border, but the problem is way overblown. If you look at the data, immigrants are 4 times more likely to be arrested for drug violations than undocumented immigrants, right? And 2 times more likely to be arrested for violent crimes than undocumented immigrants, and somewhere in between, so between 2 and 4 times more for property crimes. So the source of the problem is not immigration. It's not the immigrants that you're seeing in the news. There are cartels and there is organized crime, but it's a tiny issue, and it doesn't have anything to do with immigration. The problem is that every election season, the most popular ad is to show some story of an undocumented immigrant or a gang member who brought drugs through the border, and to generalize that to every newcomer. That's a political tactic, but the data just doesn't support that that's something you should be worried about. In fact, when immigrants move into a community, crime goes down. So I would say, separate kind of hype from fact. Stephen, if you have a perspective on the legal issues, please go.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. There was that wonderful series this week on WHYY about immigration, and there was an immigration Border Patrol official saying, hey, the more time we're spending trying, assisting people who are looking to apply for asylum, right? Families coming in, we're trying to figure out how to get them processed. The less time we could spend on the issue of working on the sort of the drug trafficking. I think there are different groups of people we're talking about. It's a different concern, right? Sure, Border Patrol can work on preventing that sort of, trafficking. But it's a different population, right? We're talking about the people who are coming as families seeking humanitarian assistance.
Thanks for the question, Terry. It's a very good one. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have a question they'd like to pose?
Hi, this is Rosemary Holt. I put it in the chat, but just wanting to know how we address, and from the league's standpoint, just how do we address the fears, and the data really helps, so thank you for that. But from a policy standpoint, how do we change the narrative, particularly around the border crossings where Florida and Texas really kind of, constantly steal the headlines with, their actions and taking people up on buses, and it just doesn't give room for the narrative of what actually is happening with these people.
So I'll say that it's an excellent question. Like, changing the narrative, it's key. I don't know if it's a policy question to change the narrative. I think it's a question of how we talk about immigrants and immigration in our cities. In Pennsylvania, where we've introduced legislation for Office of New Pennsylvanians, with the stated goal is, like, we know the immigration as a whole is a net benefit, as Professor Hernandez was saying, to the state. So we want to attract immigrants and newcomers to the state. That's the goal. And you have other states with similar state offices, other cities with similar offices that have explicitly said that from a government position, is we're trying to attract newcomers, we're trying to attract immigrants because we know it's good population-wise, working age, people-wise, all sorts of different reasons. So that I think that's part of it. The other one is to tell the stories. I think, one site, I read the New American Economy has a lot of stories that sort of talk about the contribution of immigrants, particularly on economic issues across the country. And those are the stories that get buried when we're in election season.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I would just add one thing, that there is also some research on what helps persuade people and change narratives. There is evidence that facts do help. That is, when people are exposed to correct information, they do change their minds or update their beliefs. But those facts have to be presented in a certain way. If you treat someone as, hey, you're just a total idiot, you don't get this, all right, that was a dumb question, shouldn't you know this? That doesn't help. And so some of the processes that help the most have to do with focusing first on shared values. So I think there's a lot of people who do have honest questions, and they're asking good questions. And those come from a shared value. For example, the question of crime that Terry asked is a really good question. And we share the value that we want safe communities, right? So I think the first thing is to acknowledge, like, yeah, we share that. We want safe communities. We can agree on that. Now, here's how immigration contributes to that thing we agree on. Or, we want a healthy economy. Here's how immigration contributes. So I think if you appeal to the shared value, as opposed to just focusing on the myth busting, the research suggests that goes over a little bit better.
Perhaps a fact sheet could be written about what's actually the actual numbers are, so that it's not something that we're all guessing about, because you hear so many things. There are commercials being made where there was an American was killed by an immigrant, and then it became an anti-Biden commercial. Okay, and then I just read something 2 days ago by Jen Psaki in the MSNBC Daily. She writes a daily email pretty much. And this is a Trump quote. He said he would treat migrants as enemy combatants, using the U.S. Armed Forces to detain and deport millions of undocumented immigrants in violation of the law. So we're trying to help them, but then we've got possibly the army going after them. So this is a really tough problem to solve. It's not going to be easy. But on a lighter side, in Delaware County, we have the Delco Literacy Council, and the mayor of Chester, Stephen Roots, he has been recognizing achievements of adult learners, such as obtaining their GED and learning the languages, obviously, and becoming citizens, completing job training, winning an essay contest, and they have case managers for problem solving, any of the barriers, and they've been doing this for almost 50 years. And then also the Media Fellowship House, youth and families just started a garden on May 4th, and they're working together to produce fresh fruits and vegetables. And they are also trying to form a community of a sense of belonging and solidarity. So we have really people who want to help, and then people who are discouraged when they hear this kind of news about what's going to happen to these immigrants or refugees. And it's very difficult. It's a really big problem.
Yeah, if I could perhaps jump in on that real quick, Marilyn.
Sure.
I think that there's a big disconnect between sort of the national federal politics rhetoric and what really happens on the ground. And so I'm more optimistic for this reason. So more than 2/3 of Americans are favorable toward immigrants. When you talk to people who deal in reality, right? Not who are trying to garner federal votes, but people who deal in reality. So I spent a lot of time talking to small and medium business owners who need to make their business work, right? And who need to recruit people to keep their businesses alive, to create jobs for everyone. When you talk to people who are trying to solve local issues of safety, or we're trying to fight urban blight, or solve any real issue, the kinds of issues that your organization deals with at the grassroots level, those people overwhelmingly tend to have favorable opinions of immigrants because immigrants are the solution, right? People, I would say people are the solution to issues, and many places have a shortage of people, and so immigrants solve them. And so I think it's important to also separate that a lot of that rhetoric that you're going to hear during election season is divorced from the reality that people face on the ground. Now, yes, it does mobilize a certain base of voters, but from what we know, that's still a minority of America. It's a very passionate minority, but it is a minority. And so I think we do have to address that, but let's not forget that there is a fairly large majority who's sort of willing to engage on the issue in a constructive way.
Marilyn, I don't know if you see that Jack Nagel has his hand raised to
No,
ask a question.
Go ahead, Jack.
I have a devil's advocate question for Zeke.
Yeah.
In your chart of the proportion of immigrants in the population over time, the low point was the 1950s and 60s, and those decades are remembered as a time when the U.S. economy was relatively egalitarian, far more than it is now, and were the heyday of the unionized working class jobs. Is that related at all to the low proportion of immigrants back then, or is that independent in your view?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It is independent. So one is that those are, like you said, remembered as the heyday. If you look at the numbers, Americans are actually wealthier today than they were then. The economy was less unequal. That's actually true, Jack. So inequality was much lower back then. I think that there were a few unique historical circumstances. One of them was the baby boom. So as the number of immigrants dropped precipitously, the jump in birth rates from the baby boom partially kind of compensated for the lack of foreign-born people that were coming into the country. We don't have that now. We're below birth replacement rate, and we will be. And so we don't have a baby boom. The other thing is that you have to remember that most of the world was in shambles as a result of World War II, whereas today there's just a lot more geopolitical competition for talent, for technology. And so it was a time where America was sort of the only game in town, and it had the disproportionate influence. So it was kind of a golden age for America, but mostly because of the rest of the world was in such bad shape. And so the historical circumstances were different. I think I'll stop there, but those would be some of the reasons why that's unrelated to immigration per se.
Okay, Renee?
Yes, some of the realistic barriers are, especially in the major cities, immigrants are being channeled to cities that are already depleted of resources that the residents there are struggling to get and now have to compete. So this is a real, not just again in suburban areas where people fear crime. These are people trying to struggle day to day. And now, and this is just the way it is for survival, people are competing with a new wave of a population that are coming in that are taking resources that are not in the cities. So that's going to be a challenge. And I do think it's more, there is a lot more resistance than maybe it's listened to, or maybe that's charted, because again, it has to be done and there has to be a lot more of a federal connection for this. But just like these Texas and Florida, where they're sending people just on buses or planes to these cities unprepared for the drain on the resources. And those residents, again, there's an inequity, a large inequity for the people who are already there.
Very good points that you've made. Now, someone asked a question about why are Upper Darby and Chester such magnets for immigrants?
Stephen, do you want to take any of those points or?
I will leave the economic question to you. I think there's on the chat too related to that question about the cost of services, the financial cost, economic cost, kids in school, things of that nature. Upper Darby and Chester, only in the context, I don't have specific, answer to those questions other than that chart I was showing as to immigration just to the suburbs and thinking about where there are opportunities, one, to be reunited with family that's already there and communities that are already there, services that exist in those areas for the community, different immigrant communities. And then, of course, availability of housing that makes sense for the group. But those are generalizations. It's not particular to Upper Darby or Chester. I'm unsure.
Well, they do have a lot of languages, at least in Upper Darby. There's over 50 languages spoken. So it is hard to address a group like that. But they do try very hard to get through it. And they do have English as a second language classes. So and Chester does have some of the same things too. So that's okay. There are lots of questions. That was somebody else who hasn't had a turn yet.
Can I just
sorry, I just wanted to comment on the Upper Darby issue. So, there's actually 81 different languages spoken in the Upper Darby High School. It's the largest one in Pennsylvania with that diversity. And the other reason that I can speak to personally, I'm a daughter of immigrants. My parents both came from Ireland and settled in Upper Darby, like so many immigrant communities. They start there and we call it the migration up the pike. And they, it's just because there's availability of affordable housing and resources there and an education system. And that's where I started. And, when my parents came here, I was I was born here and then we moved back to Ireland. So I just feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding about immigrants and what happens in Upper Darby. If it wasn't for the immigrants in Upper Darby would be, many of the businesses there are all immigrant-based businesses. Just like my parents, we had a bar and restaurant. So I just wanted people to think just what both of our speakers are saying today, that there is such a positive economic impact for people coming into our communities. And, the negatives that are assumed that they're taking resources and things, while there is maybe an initial impact, the long-term impact is just not there. They contribute far more.
Could I? Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to address Renee's point. I don't want it to go unaddressed because I think she is raising a lot of important points here. So I think that it's useful here, Renee, to separate the immigration system from immigration, right? Immigration is people coming and what they do, and that's overwhelmingly positive. Then there's the immigration system, which is how we manage it. And that has a ton of problems in this country. One of them that you got at, I think fairly, is that in the short run, there are places that bear a disproportionate share of the welcoming costs. So states and localities do. That's not a problem with immigration. It's a problem with the immigration system, right? That doesn't allocate those resources to bear the initial costs. From the research evidence, we know that education is actually education for the children is the biggest cost of welcoming immigrants, because immigrants tend to have more children than natives. But in the next generation, those children and their grandchildren pay back in taxes more than double what it costs states to receive them, to welcome them. And so you can think of people as an investment, because if you would rather have fewer people in the community, that also means you're having fewer taxpayers, fewer business owners, fewer people with new ideas, fewer workers. But you're absolutely right. And so the issue is that the federal government isn't doing anything to address the inequities in the fiscal expenses that are sometimes needed to be spent in the first few months or first couple of years of a newcomer. And we don't have any federal system of reimbursement in the same way that we do, say, for our public education system, where the federal government does reimburse, or we don't have federal reimbursement for healthcare costs at the state level. So I think that it's a valid complaint that mayors and governors sometimes make toward the federal government. However, it's also a complaint that is often dangerous in the sense that you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because the answer isn't, well, just keep these people out because those people are bringing a lot of economic gains. It's just find a better reimbursement system. That's probably, I think, the balanced way to think about it.
Can I just add that I think one of the ways we saw that play out was with the bust immigrants, right, from Texas, primarily, is the idea that cities that did feel overwhelmed turned to the federal government and said, hey, we're taking on these costs up front. How can we sort of get reimbursed for that? And it's a challenge. It's correct, right? The system itself, it's not an easy way to do that. But that's absolutely right. Overall, the country can absorb those costs, but trying to figure out initially how it's done. I wanted to add one more, and I know we're running short on time, which is also to think about, often we think about immigration as like, oh, newcomers, oh, people arriving to my neighborhood. The vast majority of immigrants have been in the US a very long time, right? So over about 70% of immigrants have been in the US at this point over 14 years. Almost half of the immigrants in the US have been here more than, since before 2000, so what, 24 years. We are talking about people who are already in the community. They are already your neighbors. They're already your classmates in school, your coworkers, and so on. And I bring that up because often, one of the policies or immigration laws that people support often is the DREAM Act, the idea that we're going to give some sort of status, not enough to pass it. The DREAM Act hasn't passed, but at least in public polling, the vast majority support this idea that people who arrived as children, who have built their lives here, who speak, who like grew up here, got their education, or buying homes, or working, doing all that, building their lives, that, hey, that makes sense. Like, this is really their community. They should get lawful status. And there's a lot of support for that. But over half of all immigrants in the US have been here over 24 years. It's the same argument, right? That they didn't enter necessarily as children, but they have built their lives here. They've created jobs. They've employed people. They consume, so they contribute to the economy, right? They're already, again, right? They're already our friends, neighbors, family members, and so on. So I think as people think more about that and not always the news, like, oh, the new arrival, like the vast majority have been here, 14 years plus. To keep that in mind when you think about, it's like, who are we talking about when we're talking about and proposing something like legislation that would give people status for those who don't have. Now, look, over half of those immigrants are also already citizens, right? Like immigrants are foreign born. Even in Philadelphia, over half of the immigrants in Philadelphia are US citizens. Around 70% have lawful, or more than that, are residents or are ready to become citizens as well, those that aren't yet citizens. There was a law, it's called registry. In 1986, it was updated to say anybody who had entered the US and was present since 1972, so going back 14 years, that can show that they were, hadn't committed certain crimes and were contributing and so on, could become a lawful permanent resident. For a long time, that law was updated, and sort of every several, years it'd get updated, and that made sense. But in 1986 was the last time that was updated. There was a recognition then, under the Reagan administration still, right, that people who have built their lives here should have a way to, make their status lawful. now we're talking about people who have been here the same amount of time, 14, the vast majority, 14 years or longer, updating the registry law or coming up with a different comprehensive immigration reform law would make a lot of sense to legalize the status of those that don't have it, or to make more permanent the status of those that have temporary statuses.
I think Viola's asking a question. I don't know, Marilyn, you're moderating. Do you want us to answer Viola's
Go ahead,
question?
Viola.
Yeah.
You need to unmute, Viola.
No, I think she wrote it down. The question is, the Immigration and Nationality Act allows the U.S. to give thousands of visas annually. Could the problem be a huge number over the allotted number is occurring? Yeah, so this is I think if I understand it right, you're asking, well, this is about the problem of illegal immigration or undocumented immigration. And it's true, the U.S. does have a very large undocumented population, as Stephen mentioned. I think that one thing I'd like to address here, and again, this is based on evidence, there is not just my opinion, but is why we have such a large undocumented population. I get a lot of letters and emails about this, and the most common argument that people make is, well, we just have a lot of bad actors or bad apples crossing the border who are violating the law. The truth is, when you have 11 to 12 million permanent residents who are here without authorization, it's not that you have just a few bad apples, it's that our whole system for bringing apples into the country is bad, right? And that's what I mean by separate the system from immigration. We allow 1 million green cards legal, like, per year, right? That's about how many the US gives, 1 million green cards or permanent residence visas. Half of those people, at least half, were already in the country before, and actually most of them probably were. But let's be generous and say that's half. Okay, so that would mean about 500,000 new people, which is a very high estimate. Our economy loses 700,000 working age people to death every year. So 700,000 people in prime working age die in the United States each year. That's not counting retirees. That's not counting people before working age. Right? So we're not even allowing enough people to fill the jobs lost, right? The positions lost by those 700,000 people who die, let alone the jobs created by new businesses, by new innovations. So the problem is that the last time the Nationality Act was updated was 1990. Okay, the economy was $9 trillion in size then. Today it's $25 trillion in size. So we have an economy that's over twice the size, and we still have a system that allows people for an economy that was like much smaller than it is now. So this is the bottom line. The main reason we have undocumented immigration is because we don't allow enough people in. And so businesses, small and medium businesses, need people, and immigrants know that they're going to get jobs, and they come. Is that right? No, it's probably not the right way to do it. But I think we have to match reality. So we have to give actually a lot more visas. And the best solution to undocumented immigration is more legal immigration. And I know that that's not palatable to many people, but that's just kind of how it works. The system just doesn't match the economic reality. And so then you get kind of a black market system, which results in undocumented immigration.
Is there anyone else who has any comments they'd like to make? We have, it's just 2 o'clock now. Last chance.
Can I ask you before you leave? I know that you do the legal end at the Nationality Services Center. What are the biggest legal issues that immigrants face that you deal with?
Good question. I think lawful status generally, right? So that's the immigration legal work that we do. People who are in removal proceedings. We do a lot of work for detained immigrants, but also family-based immigration is the other large part. So people petitioning for their spouses and children, things of that nature. But as our practice, we work on all types of immigration issues other than employment-based, because that's more, private practice type work. But it is that full range. And then really, I think the majority, or around half of our clients, are Latin American, Caribbean, from that region, and a growing number of African immigrants as that population is growing in the city as well. But it's mostly trying to figure out a way to either keep status or apply for status.
are there specific recommendations that you would make to changes in the law? I mean, that's such your
Yeah.
expertise. I would love to hear more.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of little places, right? So immigration, I mean, I think some of it, we're often in a defensive position during an election cycle. All these attempts to make asylum more difficult. So I think a lot of organizing and advocacy is around trying to make sure people have a fair opportunity to apply for asylum. There's a lot of, from both parties, suggestions to shorten the process, where again, it's a process where people who just fled a country, often with nothing but the clothes on their back, are being asked to present evidence to support their case in shorter and shorter periods of time. So that's one. But then there's a lot more specific stuff, from the DREAM Act for the youth to an Afghan Adjustment Act. Like the Afghans I was talking about don't have permanent status in the US. They were afforded only short-term temporary relief, although they were allies and interpreters and so on for the US forces that were in Afghanistan, but they're not really being provided a chance to make their status permanent. So that's a big push. Saving the refugee program, I think under the prior administration, it was really decimated, and it's taken time to bring it back up to speed. It's not quite where it was, but it's it's going to be under attack again, and sort of making sure that that's an avenue for people as well. So there are a lot of policy issues, and of course, the big one that talking about registry or just some sort of immigration reform to give status to a large number of those folks that don't have status in the US right now.
Thank you. It gave us an idea of where we can start to advocate.
Yeah, and I'll throw one more out just because we're trying to build support, which is the Office for New Pennsylvanians. It's been proposed in the state legislature multiple years in a row now. It's obviously, this is the first year it's had. It probably doesn't have a real opportunity to get picked up besides passing one chamber, but building that support for it over time, and different representatives are supportive of it. So I'd be happy to follow up on that and make those connections as well.
Ralph made a point to, first of all, as chair of the committee, one of the committees that put this program on, Ralph made the point that we hope to follow this program with a second program. It would be in the fall on immigration to explore the experience of actually being an immigrant living in our area. So today was the big picture. In the fall, we hope to bring it even to that smaller, intimate piece of being an immigrant here in Southeast. I would just like to say in closing that I want to thank both of you for presenting and sharing your expertise. We also thank all those that registered for this presentation. And as stated, we will be sending a link to the recording and additional resources related. Just this morning, I don't know if anybody caught it, but this morning on the morning edition of NPR, there was a interview with Mayorkas and Steve Inscape talking about this topic. And I woke up to that and I thought, wow, how timely is all this? So we're going to gather resources, as many resources. If you have resources you want to share that we can share with others, that would be great. So we'll put that together and send it out, including Zeke, the information on your book. We hope that you will join us for future programs, and go to our events calendar. You're going to see that this month alone, we have 3 more voter information events out and about in the community. We're also doing one in June. So we keep the conversation going, and thank you for attending.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.